everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast, we'll be looking at the common elements between mystics and artists. This topic was inspired by a quote I read from Joseph Campbell in The Way of Art, and this is the quote: "The way of the mystic and the artist are related, except the mystic doesn't have a craft." And I thought, what an interesting quote, and I pondered it, and I thought it's important to make a distinction here, and that is that he's not saying that a mystic can't have a craft, but he is saying that a mystic isn't defined by having a craft, whereas an artist is. Also, an artist doesn't necessarily have to believe in God or have a conscious spiritual practice or belief in order to have something in common with mystics. And this is what this essay explores. It's called On Mystics and Artists, and it's taken from my book called The Farthest Reaches of Inner Space, A Course in Miracles and the Postmodern World. Now, this volume of essays was written during a time where I was interested in the idea of authenticity, something that you hear a lot about these days, what it means to be authentic. And when I came across this quote by Joseph Campbell on the mystic and the artist, I also watched a YouTube clip that happened to be in my feed about the recording artist Linda Ronstadt and her induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I learnt more about her career and some of her thoughts. I saw a documentary about her and it started to gel. The pieces started to fall together in relation to the quote from Joseph Campbell and Linda Ronstadt's career and her thoughts, and that's how I came up with this essay. The essay is called On Mystics and Artists, and it answers a question I have had for a while, which is there a link between becoming more of who you are as a personality, being true to your innate temperament, likes and dislikes, proclivities, talents, and spiritual growth? That is why the idea of the mystic and the artist being related was appealing to me, and I wrote this essay to try and answer that question of mine. So I'll begin reading now on mystics and artists. In 2014, much to my delight, Linda Ronstadt was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Ronstadt was recognised not only for her formidable voice, but for her diversity as a recording artist. While you might be familiar with classics such as It's So Easy, Blue by You, and You're No Good, many people would be surprised to learn that Ronstadt also recorded an album of traditional Mexican folk songs called Canción de mi Padre, Songs of My Father, and many apologies for my pronunciation, my terrible pronunciation of Songs of My Father. Okay, carrying on. When Ronstadt approached her record company with the idea for Songs of My Father, the powers that be were against it, sure that such a project would kill the star's burgeoning career. Ronstadt fought hard for the opportunity to do the album, stating in later interviews that she felt she'd just die if she didn't do it. Against all advice, but with a nod from her record company, Ronstadt went ahead with the project. Something innate impelled her forward, and much to everyone's surprise, the record became a hit, and a big one. To date, it is the best-selling non-English language album in US music history. Now we come to the first subtitle, A Leap of Faith. To my mind, Ronstadt's determination to follow that inner imperative is a mark of a genuine artist. Though her record company made a rational case for not doing the album, Ronstadt relied on what philosopher Soren Kierkegaard called subjective truth. This isn't the kind of subjective truth we usually talk about, the kind where one person's perspective differs from someone else's. Instead, Kierkegaard uses the term for internal motivations and intuitions that often can't be rationally justified. They are felt or experienced. To act on them, therefore, requires Kierkegaard's leap of faith. In his book Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard discusses how being open to subjective truths allows us to live out possibilities upon which our human destinies and spiritual fulfillment depend. It's faith that this is what subjective truths lead us towards that gives us the courage to move beyond our fears. If we instead choose to avoid the anxiety of possibilities, the what-ifs, we encounter another form of anxiety, one associated with not being true to ourselves, both on a personal and spiritual level. Kierkegaard calls this infidelity sinfulness and suggests associated guilt produces what he calls objective anxiety, anxiety that we attribute to something tangible outside of us in the world, such as a bill, an untidy room, an ache or pain, or anything and everything in our day. We might have avoided facing the anxiety of possibility by clinging to the known, the predictable, and the widely accepted, but we've simply replaced it with anxiety of another kind. Subtitle: No one is an island. The anxiety of loneliness is another significant influence on our choices. Obeying a subjective truth will often have us standing alone, at least for a while. During that time, we're likely to be the subject of criticism and judgment, as exemplified in letters between the artist Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo. Letters from Theo convey his father's worry over Vincent's lack of a proper job and seemingly aimless existence. In defence, Vincent replies that though the ultimate goal of his endeavours isn't clear to him, it will make itself known as he progresses step by step. And this is a quote from Vincent's letter to his brother Theo. But what's your ultimate goal, you'll say? The goal will become clearer, will take shape slowly and surely as the crocus becomes a sketch and the sketch a painting, as one works more seriously, as one digs deeper into the originally vague idea, the first fugitive, passing thought, unless it becomes firm. End of quote. It's in working from this place that the artist experiences an inner integrity common to the mystic. In his autobiography, The Seven-Storied Mountain, theologian, poet, and Trappist monk Thomas Merton captures this intersection in this description of his parents. Quote, "They were in the world and not of it, not because they were saints, but in a different way, because they were artists. The integrity of an artist lifts a man above the level of the world without delivering him from it." End of quote. The sensitivity shared by mystics and artists brings them into contact with the realm of subjective truths in a very real way. This is when they feel their truest selves. This is why it's so difficult for them not to proceed along their path, no matter how unconventional or impractical it might seem. In modern psychological terms, we could say that mystics and artists do things for their own sake, which is what we call intrinsic motivation, rather than to meet an external goal, which we would call extrinsic motivation, and so their actions are authentic. It's little wonder that Christian scholar Evelyn Underhill, in Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness, refers to mystics and artists as cousins. Quote, "For the reality to which the artist and the mystic are exposed is, in fact, the same. It is of their inmost truth, brought to consciousness by the mystic in direct confrontation and by the artist through reflection in the masterworks of his art." End of quote. The sensitivity of artists and mystics relates to a capacity for contemplation and silence. However, where the artist might place an emphasis on their art as an end in itself, the mystic is clear that their goal is union with the beloved, with God. While the sensitivity they share may seem like a boon, artists and mystics commonly experience significant emotional and psychological turbulence. Why this is the case and how it can lead the artist to stray off course is the subject of the following section. Subtitle: The Ultimate Dragon. With a sensitivity to subjective truths comes intimacy with the shame and guilt that would keep us from acting on them. The source of joy and the source of dread lie side by side. The greatest treasure is guarded by the ultimate dragon. That dragon is our self-concept. The mystic's conscious aim is purgation of the self, or the clearing away of all that is I, me, and mine. Selfishness, judgment, competitiveness, unkindness, pride, basically anything that relates to emotional neediness and its demands, anything that relates to the ego. This leads to a lack of self-centeredness that clears the way for union with the divine, whose reality is only love. Because of this conscious purpose, the mystic is able to keep on the narrow path, following their subjective truths, where an artist might lose their way. Where the mystic is forever mindful of how they conduct themselves with others, the artist can become obsessive about their work at the cost of their relationships. A case in point is author J.D. Salinger. I remember reading his novella Franny and Zooey and being impressed by its imaginative exploration of how to integrate spirituality with daily living. I was surprised, therefore, to later discover some facts about Salinger's personal life, in particular his relationship with Claire Douglas. Douglas, aged 21, dropped out of college to marry Salinger, aged 36, and move into his cottage in the woods of New Hampshire. Soon afterwards, Douglas became pregnant and gave birth to their first child. At first, Salinger was a doting father. However, things changed within a few months. Dramatically switching gears, Salinger became obsessively focused on his writing, to the exclusion of his new family. He built a concrete room 100 metres from their house and furnished it with a bed, stove and writing desk. He also developed a routine whereby he rose at dawn, then retreated to his writing bunker, insisting that he be undisturbed. There he'd remain until returning to the house for dinner, or he'd simply stay in his bunker, without letting Claire know, to sleep, seemingly oblivious to his wife's feelings and frustrations. Ironically, it was during this time that Salinger wrote Franny and Zooey. A bunker is an apt term for Salinger's writing room. We must wonder if he was really engaged with an inner imperative based on a subjective truth, or using his art to defend himself against anxiety. He could rationalise his hurriedness and exclusive focus as a sign of artistic integrity instead of seeing it for what it most likely was, a defence against the depth of intimacy that his marriage and new role as a father were calling for. It's likely that the prospect of deepening intimacy made Salinger anxious, and that this was related to shame and guilt associated with his past. To be emotionally vulnerable in relationship to another person was to open up a can of worms. And so Salinger focused on his art. We'll never know to what extent Franny and Zooey might have been a different book if Salinger had also chosen, in fear and trembling, to work through his issues. But we can say that if he had chosen to do so, he wouldn't have only been practicing the art of writing, but the art of living as well. Subtitle: The Art of Living. We can learn much about ourselves from observing relationships, as was made clear to me recently in dealing with a home maintenance issue. I'd arranged for a plumber to attend an outdoor drainage problem, and he installed a temporary solution. A city council officer paid a visit a couple of days later to inform me that the new drainage arrangement was illegal and would have to be addressed as soon as possible. He made a call to the plumber then and there, and the exchange between them was tense. "Are you a plumber?" the plumber asked the officer, challenging his judgment of the situation. "No, I'm not a plumber. My job is to enforce the regulations." A pointless back and forth ensued until the plumber agreed to come to the property in the morning and make the drainage compliant. The officer came mid-morning to see if the plumber had done as asked. He hadn't. The officer phoned him again. The plumber eventually arrived half an hour later, but the officer had already left, asking me to call him once the job was done. What struck me about the two men was how different they were. The plumber was a laid-back type. The officer was diligent with a capital D. Some people get a little bit of power and it goes to their head, the plumber said to me, referring to the officer. He really should have known better, said the officer about the plumber's dodgy solution. And there I was, interacting with each separately, hearing their criticisms of each other while the two of them never met. I wondered what might happen if the plumber and officer were to sit in a room together to discuss their differences. No doubt there'd be a vigorous exchange. Things could get nasty, a bit chaotic, but surely if left in the room long enough, they'd soon get tired of the conflict, accept their common humanity instead, their shared experience that life isn't easy, things are never cut and dried, that we all make mistakes and so on. Then perhaps they'd part more balanced individuals, each prepared to take on board a little of what the other had to offer. As long as they stayed apart, however, they could indulge their antagonism and it would grow. Extending the opposites stuck in a room together analogy, I think of recording studios and how some of the greatest albums were created in a chaotic, oppositional atmosphere. Rumours by Fleetwood Mac is one of those albums. Group members Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham had decided to split up, and Christine and John McVie had divorced. The studio atmosphere was heated and tense, and yet, somewhat ironically, Rumours is highly regarded for its harmonies. This might seem odd, that an acclaimed album came out of such a challenging environment. But what, after all, is harmony but the simultaneous expression of various voices? Yet there isn't a cacophony of sound. In the recording studio, there is respect for the overall purpose of the relationships gathered, some higher aim. Though the members of Fleetwood Mac were at loggerheads in their personal lives, they could employ a constructive use of differences in their work. The thing about different interests, perspectives, and ways of being is that in order to maintain a functional relationship, you have to think, you have to reflect on your own responses, on what you think matters and what doesn't. And you can't paint with broad strokes, labelling someone and their input as all wrong or all bad all of the time. You can't go on autopilot, the enemy of creativity. A recording studio in a metaphorical Pleasantville would produce dull, hypnotic music that takes us nowhere. I see this as a metaphor for what goes on inside all of us. To engage in a dialogue between opposites is to get a little crazy for a while, to feel off-kilter as we feel the tension between one aspect of ourselves and its shadow, diligence and carelessness, dogmatism and libertarianism, compliance and rebellion, isolation and connection. But this period is a necessary step towards letting go of shame and guilt, which lead to extremes, and as we do this, we clear the way for a deeper engagement with subjective truths, or our authentic impulses. This kind of process was integral to Jung's analytic psychology. "Show me a sane man, and I will cure him for you," said Jung, according to an interview with his assistant, Jolandi Jacobi. What we call sanity or stability is a person not in the midst of a major threshold of growth. It's while we're crossing the threshold, which will always involve addressing shame and guilt, that the wobbliness begins. But we must be prepared to pass through it to further embody the fullness of our personal and spiritual selves. If we apply the sensitivity of the artist to our relationships, becoming an observer of our contradictions and the emotional neediness related to them, we are engaged in the art of living, the highest form of art there is. We are all cousins of the artist and mystic when we allow the development of our life to be directed by Kierkegaard's subjective truth, maintaining the purity of our connection by sharing in the mystic's conscious purpose of letting go of the I. We face our fears, our shame and guilt, and pray, forgive, meditate, have therapy, or do whatever we feel will help us be emotionally available in our relationships and work. Looking back on Linda Ronstadt's career, I think of several songs that I love. But what has struck me recently is the quality of her relationships. Whilst watching footage of a tribute to Ronstadt given at the Kennedy Center Honours in 2019, I was deeply moved by Emmylou Harris's speech honouring her friend. It showed how much Ronstadt has prized her personal relationships as much as her art, and that these two realms of life are compatible. Indeed, they inspire each other. And that is the end of the essay on mystics and artists. For me, it is clear that being true to yourself, to your personality, to your temperament, to your likes, all that kind of thing, to your inner guidance as to who you are as a person, that authenticity is linked to spirituality and spiritual growth. And that was a major premise of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy. In his writings, he emphasises being yourself, your individual, before God. So it's the courage to be who you are before God. And you get the courage to be who you are from standing before God, from connecting with Jesus. And that was a major part of Kierkegaard's philosophy. He also emphasised having to navigate opposites, and that we do that by being a self before God. It's by that connection to what we would call, as Course in Miracles students, the Holy Spirit, being open to that inner inspiration beyond the ego, that helps us navigate those opposites and be a balanced person, which really means being able to come from love rather than leaning on an habitual stance, which will always be a bit off kilter. It starts to lend to the extremes when we're not being who we are and when we're not being guided by that inner spiritual self. It's not that we should never be an extreme or express an extreme. It's that habitual leaning, that habitual pattern that is the problem. That's the autopilot that the essay talked about. So I'd like to end with a paragraph that I wrote quite a while ago when I was writing some things about the Stoic philosophers and about Socrates. This paragraph relates to Socrates, who was a very spiritual person himself. In Plato's Republic, which is all about how the state could be run most beneficially, Socrates suggests that the mature person turn upward the vision of their souls and fix their gaze on what sheds light on all, and when they have thus beheld the good itself, they shall use it as a pattern for the right ordering of the state. So that was something that Socrates said, and the good that he refers to is the good with a capital G. It is that abstract oneness. It is that spiritual presence beyond the material world. Now, the thing about Socrates is that he always emphasised the good, yet he was very much a personality. He was very much himself. And this is wonderfully described in another section of Plato's dialogues called the Symposium. And I'd like to read out a paragraph I wrote many years ago when I was thinking of writing something about Socrates, but I didn't. But anyway, this is what I had to say about this incident in the Symposium, which really describes what I'm trying to say about Socrates being very spiritual, but also being an individual. So this is what I wrote. Turning our gaze upwards doesn't mean that we have to, quote, close our eyes to ourself, which is paraphrasing Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who really had a thing against Plato and Socrates and the idea of a transcendent metaphysical plane, because he did feel that it led us to be life deniers and to deny who we are as a person, as a human, as a personality. Okay, so I'll just read that sentence again. Turning our gaze upwards doesn't mean we have to close our eyes to ourselves, to paraphrase Nietzsche, or that we will lose a strong sense of self in the process. Perhaps the best example of this comes from Plato's Symposium, an account of speeches on the nature of love given at a dinner party. Alcibiades, a politician and military commander, stumbles in upon the gathering, a little drunk, and declares that Socrates stands alone in greatness and goodness. He then goes on to say that the most amazing thing about Socrates is his uniqueness. Even Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War, could be likened to the Spartan officer Brasidas, explains Alcibiades. Socrates, however, stood alone. He was more uniquely himself than anyone else. And I think I'll leave the podcast there to emphasize the point that being spiritual and growing in our spirituality does not mean we become a bland version of ourselves or lose ourselves, our uniqueness in the process. You lose your investment in the ego, in the shame and the guilt, in the identification with that. You lose that and you lose the attachment to the self. But the ironic thing is that you become more of yourself in terms of a unique individual. And with that, I'll sign off. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion. Tune in again. Thank you. Bye.